Everybody's still here. Upright, mostly, right here? I don't think we have too many announcements. The schedule tomorrow is pretty much the same. Or it is the same, exactly the same, except, I believe, Dr. Lose will present in the morning. Dr. Batiza in the evening, is that right? We'll have, Bishop Steve Delzer will be our preacher tomorrow night. So, thank you, Bishop Delzer. And, it's funny calling you Bishop Delzer because we know each other a long time.
Steve works.
Any questions, concerns, compliments or gripes? Anything that we need to go over yet today? I was asking Chad if there's anything that feels a little warmer in here tonight, so yeah, that's good. Okay. Well, in the story of you can't make things up, I had, David for 2 of my preaching classes at Luther Seminary and another class on Long Gospel and then an independent study. And then already 3.5 years now. Well, almost about 4 years to the day or so.
Yeah.
David was at Mount Olivet and there were some pastoral openings and he said you don't have lunch. and so then one thing led to another, and I get to work with this guy now too, so it's pretty fun. And we get to serve Mount Olivet, which is a very unique congregation, to say the least. But it's a good one.
There's a bishop in the room, so I feel like I should wreck that story a little bit.
Oh yeah.
X.
It was still a call committee and still an interview.
No, and sincerely, when there was a pastor or candidate or former student or friend that I was interested in, the first conversation was usually just checking in, how are you doing?
It was.
And in the middle of that conversation, you had mentioned you were actually thinking about a change of call.
Yeah.
And had already talked with your bishop and your colleague, and so at that point, maybe we should talk a little more.
Well, anyway,
Thank you.
we're grateful to have Reverend Dr. David Lose with us tonight, so thanks for being here.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks, everyone. I feel like I saw a number of you on the slopes. I had such a fun day. So, yeah, and tired. I'm sure you are too. Love presenting at night. So here's what I want to do, and I forgot my little clicker, so I'm gonna. This is not the greatest, particularly for you guys for presenting wise, but I'm gonna stay close to this so I can keep advancing the slides. As I mentioned last night, what I want to do is talk a little bit about church after COVID, or explore that as kind of the overarching theme this our time together. Not imagining I have answers, but rather some observations, and hopefully some collective wisdom and some pondering and questions that we can raise together and maybe try to address, if not answer. And so it's, oh, thank you. Yeah, that'd be perfect. Thank you. Something's working. Just see if it works. Alright, tell you what, you want to mess with it? I'll just keep doing this. Alright, sorry. So, church after COVID, and the asterisk is to recognize this as a rather optimistic title. Thank you. Because it's not like we're after COVID. We're still in the middle of it. And I remember vividly, maybe one of those things that and Lord's Prayer are the last two things I remember before, as I move into senility. March the 1st, we were hosting the Arctic Explorer, Will Steger, at Mount Olivet for a really wonderful evening, and March the 1st, 2020. And I'm sitting with a few people at the head table with Will, and someone says, this coronavirus thing, you think it's going to amount to anything? It's March the 1st. Like less than 2 weeks later, the governor has an emergency executive order. And this wasn't someone who's not smart, and it wasn't like an obvious answer. It was that quickly that everything sort of change and shift and move. And then those early weeks where I felt like on a nearly daily basis, the last 2 weeks of March, I would come to church with a plan that I had thought about. I've been reading like everything I get my hands on the internet and listening to NPR, and I would get to work and I'd call the staff together and communicate the plan. Like, we're gonna be alternating days in case there's a breakout and all of this stuff. And then I'd go home that night, also listen to NPR. By the time I got home, I was driving like this thinking, this plan is inadequate. And do it again and do it again. And it was 2 weeks before Holy Week. Like, do you remember? It feels like a lifetime ago. And of course, there were some politicians who would be renamed nameless who were urging the church to open up on Easter, resurrect the church on Easter. And I remember kind of proud of myself. Well, there's no way we're going to be open Easter. I know that I'm a realist. It won't be till summer. Like, do you remember?
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until August, where it just, July and August, it sunk into me like, oh my word, we're not going to have Christmas. Like, we probably will be in this at Christmas. And my first urge, as it almost always is, to communicate that to the congregation. And one of my very wise church council members, I shared this with him, and he said, don't tell them. They are not ready for that yet. Keep month by month like you're doing. Come November, we'll share that news, and we're still in it. So this is a kind of optimistic presentation, as assuming we'll know we'll soon be after COVID. But here's what I want to do. The next couple nights, I want to just share some of the things I've been thinking about really the last couple of years, but I think COVID and the experience of the last two has really sharpened and made more important for me. And I'll get to those a little later. But first, I want to, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. First, I kind of want to remind us where things were before COVID. And so tonight, I'm going to do a little bit of kind of catch up. I had the chance for probably my last 10 years or so at Luther Seminary to do research on the state of congregational life and the causes of what was going on in our life together. And I shared that in a couple of venues. So I may have shared different pieces of this with some of you at different times. I want to kind of move through it quickly, but just a little bit of background to where we were before COVID. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong one. This doesn't take a lot of time to remind us, but we were living in a church that was shrinking. This is rates of attendance from 1970 to 2000. Everyone starts at 100% because wherever you were in 1970 is where you were. And 30 years later, that's kind of where the different traditions are. And Lutherans around the turn of the millennium, in 2000, were doing better. I mean, the best thing we could say is when we're declining, slower than most groups. And of course, the first decade or so of the 21st century, those trend lines have really gone even more steep. So we are living in a church that was shrinking. The other thing that I think is easier to forget about is we were living during a time, we were and still are living during a time of kind of unprecedented cultural change. Affecting every institution, whether it's arts and culture or education or communal groups or shopping or the church. And business, politics, everything was being changed. A lot of that was being changed by something I have described as digital pluralism, which, for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on tonight, but just recognizing that in really the last 30 years or so, the overwhelming amount of information and the ease with which to access it, to the point where most of us today would describe ourselves as kind of information overload, super saturated with information, has put into motion 6 cultural shifts. And those are the things I want to touch on briefly, and then kind of revisit this in light of our last 2 years. So first, the way I kind of describe this, these shifts, are we move, and by digital pluralism, it is the internet, it is social media, it is just the amount of information that is being produced at a 10-fold rate every couple of years. That is, every 5 years, there is 10 times more information available to us than there was 5 years earlier. And it is at all of our fingertips in almost every possible way. So what I mean by monocultural narrative to a multiple cultural narrative, there was a time when the biblical story was just at the core of Western literature and Western culture and the American education system. When you look back the first couple centuries, or the first century of this country, from early settlements on past Reformation, the New England Primer, the standard guide for teaching children early education, the Primer began teaching their kids the alphabet by A is for Adam, in whom all fall. B is for Babel, in whom, like, it was just part and parcel of the story. And so when Steinbeck would write East of Eden, it was a cultural reference everyone understood. Milton's Paradise Lost, all of these kinds of things were just touch points. Nobody had to kind of teach that background. And that story was sort of central on the whole, the wrong way. And now, this is just like a collection of magazine covers I pulled off the internet one night. And as I was kind of arranging them to kind of give a range of the things that are available, started thinking how every single one of these tells its own version of the story that we sometimes, or the ancients, would describe as the good, the beautiful, and the true. That is, every one of these magazines has something to say about what's worthwhile, what's valuable, what's worth fighting for, sacrificing for, striving for. And it's not just magazines, it's television, it's commerce, we're at this time where that biblical story has kind of shrunk our imagination, or at least we're at a time where there's this competition of many, many stories for people's attention and allegiance and value. So that's one. Somewhat monocultural to definitely multiple cultural. We've moved from the age of duty and obligation to the age of discretion. And what I mean by duty and obligation is that for a very long time, a lot of people did things simply because they thought they should. And there are all kinds of, like, I don't want any of this to seem nostalgic. That is, I am saying, woe is us, look at where we are now. It was so good back then. Not at all. But there was this kind of, there were certain things that you just never talked about needing to do because everybody knew you needed to do them. And one of them happened to be to go to church for large, not the whole of the population, but large swaths of the population. And that's no longer really the operating impulse for people coming of age to adulthood today. It is much more influenced by the sense of discretion. And I think one of the comments I've heard most frequently over the years from church council members would be along the lines of, Pastor, our generation has been, serving on church council and teaching VBS and doing Sunday school for years. When's this younger generation going? Can you finish the sentence? Step up. I always have to gently explain, you know what? Stepping up is not their first priority. And the reason I use that word discretion is because I want to be pretty sympathetic to this shift in the sense that the young adults who are at an age where their parents or grandparents would have been moving into leadership roles have been overwhelmed, bombarded by the number of choices that are possible to them. And I have the Starbucks thing up there, and I had to look it up because in my notes, when I was doing this through Schweiler, I had scribbled down like 80,000 kinds of coffee. And I was like, that can't be true. So I looked it up again today, and there are 87,000 different ways of ordering coffee at Starbucks. That it's just this, we've operated in this country under the assumption that choice is a good thing. And I think what recent psychological research has shown is that some choice over no choice is almost always a good thing. But unending choices becomes paralyzing or debilitating and is not at all a good thing. And it reminds me of times of like walking into a paint store and seeing something really naive like, we'd like to paint our living room green. And then they give me the color wheel. And I had no idea there were like 144 different kinds of green. Pea green, mint green, flash green, fresh green. And it's like, I just give it back. And I'm like, you pick one for me. I was thinking dark, medium, or light. It's overwhelming. And in that sense of kind of unending choice, where it's not, of course, paint colors, it's career, relationships, housing, transportation, political relation, identity, so many ways across the board. What happens is this kind of, whether it's real or artificial, it feels very real, the sense of an ongoing time crunch. There's never enough time. That there's always more choices than we can possibly do sufficient research and make a good choice about. All right, third, try to move through this quickly. We moved from a time when identity was largely received to a time when identity is constructed. I was thinking about this recently in relation to the incredible shift in generations, in 2 generations. So my mother, who just passed earlier this year, when she went to Gettysburg College, her primary occupational choices were she could be a nurse or she could be a teacher. And she was a teacher. 2 generations later, as I have a daughter at St. Olaf College, the choices for her are unlimited about what she can be and who she can be and what she can do. That's in 2 generations. And so coming of age today means there's a little bit that your parents or grandparents or the traditions can tell you about who you are. But most of our kids are involved from a very early age in this active process of identity construction. And they're doing it in and with and through and under the pressure of social media, which is a whole nother topic. But sometimes I think to illustrate, I think, when I was growing up, it was a big 3.
Yeah.
Actually, the other day, better than, and now, okay, all these channels to choose from, whatever. I was thinking about this with regard to the Olympics. I love the Olympics. Like, love. My earliest memories as a kid are watching the Olympics and crushing Olga Corbett, really embarrassing. And as I've gone through my life, I've never been able to get over that. Like, every 4 years, the Olympics would roll around, I would, check off the sports that I could no way possibly compete for anymore. What's left? Curling. That's my last hope is curling. And I was thinking this year I barely watched the Olympics, and I finally realized why. So, how much of it is gathered on Peacock, NBC streaming service. I go to Peacock now, and there are all these choices. Like, you can look at all the different sports and choose replays. You can choose highlights from the day. You can choose. And I'm just like, just tell me what to watch. Like it used to be Jim McKay at ABC, and he'd say, figure skating's coming now, downhill later. Thank you. It's just kind of overwhelming. So there's this kind of all this identity construction that has to go on all the time. All right, we move from a culture that values tradition to a culture that values experience and personal experience. And when you think about it, what tradition does is pass on communal identity. Like, that's the primary function of tradition, which is why when you change traditions, whether it's in a church or a family, as a new family is being formed, it's sometimes surprising to you when you think this is not a big deal if we have Thanksgiving worship on the evening before Thanksgiving instead of Thanksgiving Day to talk about a recent experience Charlie and I have had. Or if you have a discussion relatively early into your life with a partner about whether you're going to open presents on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, those are all charged with emotion. Because the value, what tradition does is passes on, this is who we are. We know who we are by what we do. And I think there's a few reasons why we've kind of lost, or tradition has lost favor. One is this kind of loss of confidence in institutions, and particularly in the late 60s, 70s, and 90s. I think part of it is we just live in this instant access world where things keep moving more and more quickly. I have a TV dinner up there because I just remember like the sense of freedom as a child when my parents were going to go out and they were like, well, who's going to make dinner? It's like, it's everywhere, we have it covered with TV dinners. You know? And it were awful, but we love them. We could just manage this ourselves, and it just keeps going, you know, into instant access. It's not that I don't like the idea of tradition. Like, I think this is the whole genius of Antiques Roadshow. It's sort of commodifying tradition to objects, and then inviting you to sort of imagine that if you have a pen that some president used to sign a bill, that kind of conveys a sense of tradition to you. Antiquing, like, that was not a, when I was a kid, we didn't have antiques. We had hand-me-downs. Like, no, we had a lot of hand-me-downs. Old stuff was just old stuff that you kept using because you could afford to buy new stuff. But then at some point, antiquing became a thing where people go out and try to buy other people's old stuff because it gives them a sense of what? A missing tradition. Or it's the reason we have why there's still a relatively high demand for church weddings. They may or may not have any interest in the life of the community beyond that day. But to get married in a beautiful church lends a sense of sort of officialness or something special about the act that's going on. All right, fifth, we've moved from a coherent sense of identity to a more segmented sense of identity. I used to think, like, I think a lot of us, identity is whether it's given to us or crafted, it is a whole intact kind of thing. And psychologists again and again are saying, you know, that whole idea of identity is a useful fiction. The fiction is that we have multiple identities, multiple components to our life, whether it's familial or work or educational or civic or religious or political or increasingly socially mediated identities, and that you are a slightly different person in each of those realms. And that's the sense that it's a fiction. There is no one you that's immutable and solid that you carry from domain to domain to domain. But it's useful. It's incredibly useful because it's very hard to kind of reckon without that sense of I am who I am, wherever I am. And it's all those different dimensions that put those together. I found this a few years ago, this next illustration. It was a bulletin cover for a memorial service for a university professor. And it's a picture mosaic, so when you zoom in, his picture is made up of all these people who are important to him. Students and colleagues and congregation members and friends, and he just kind of collected all these pictures, and that was who Gene was, which I think is kind of beautiful.
It's cool.
And true. But I think the stresses of these different competing elements have made it so that more of us have a hard time sustaining the useful fiction of a coherent identity. And finally, we move from being consumers of information to being producers. I remember when, the first iteration of the internet, we didn't call it Web 1.0, we just called it the internet or the World Wide Web. And what was amazing about that was, as I mentioned, the symbol of that era was the hyperlink, where you could call up a document, and on that document, all these things would be highlighted, and you could click it would take you somewhere else, which takes you somewhere else, take you somewhere else. It's like this, literally, the image of a World Wide Web was really apt. And then somewhere along the line, people realized there was enough bandwidth or channel strength or whatever it is, this is not my area of strength, that you didn't only have to receive, you could also contribute. And so it started as comments, about products or newspaper editorials or likes or whatever it is. And before long, it's blogs and personal blogs, and before long, it's the advent of social media has kind of accelerated all of that. And all of a sudden, the internet is far more like all that information each of us producing is information others of us can receive. But the emotional balance has shifted from simply being receivers to being producers of information. And the really wonderful part of that is the level of sense of interconnectedness and collaboration that allows, and in some ways demands. But it also shifts the way we think about what is this thing that we would name as information or even reality. Frank Rose is a longtime editor at Wired, and in one of his books a few years ago, this really stuck out to me. The concept of audience is growing outdated. Participants would be more like it. And the advent of this in kind of his world in Wired would be, whether it was an album or a movie, you know, the first iteration was, well, there'd be a pre-release of a website, you know, for Harry Potter or the new Harry Potter, whatever it would be. But it wouldn't be long before there would be multiple occasions on the website embedded for you to participate in that. And so I remember when my kids, big Harry Potter fans, the quiz to decide what house you would be in came out, and they would, I would too, truth be told, take it over and over until we ended up in Gryffindor. Gaming the system. And it just keeps going on and on and on to this point where now it's kind of overwhelming to think about the number of purported experts who are offering information. I think we felt this super keenly in the last 2 years around vaccines or science or what is that? All right, so that in kind of a nutshell is what a lot of my time was spent on thinking about, trying to explain what's happened in church. And a lot of that was, it's not that we're doing things wrong. It's not that we're not capable leaders or producing capable leaders. It's not that we're not passing on tradition. It's that the world has changed dramatically. And what does ministry look like? And that's a really hard question to offer or to answer. We're all more comfortable doing what we know best and has worked for the longest time. And for me at the time as a seminary professor, what struck me was, on the one hand, seminaries were working very, very hard to train capable and faithful leaders and send them out into the world with encouragement and skills and all of that. And at the exact same time, what I taught, what my colleagues taught, were what we were taught in many ways. It's not that we didn't grow or learn at all, but we had the opportunity to learn from really gifted teachers and put those things into practice and refine and pass that on. So we were, you know, at the one hand, centers of innovation and trying to think about the church of the future, and at the exact same time, we were bastions of the very best practices of the previous generation. And when the cultural context is kind of stable, that works okay. Because you're in that kind of performative era where you have refined it down to what works best, and you kind of know what you're talking about. When the situation rapidly changes, then that's when you need innovation, and it's a really hard thing to do because it makes us really anxious to step out of our comfort zone. I was working on this at one point and presenting with some pastors in the northwestern part of New York State, and it was like I was presenting a day after Kodak had announced that it was closing. Wasn't just filing Chapter 11. There was going to be no more Kodak. And it was just really, and that was, as any major industry when it closes company, it just shockwaves through the whole community in terms of all the subsidiary industries and congregations knowing people were going to be moving to look for jobs, all of the rippling effects of that. And just kind of processing that with them and thinking about, you know, Kodak's response to digital photography. Do you remember their tagline? Kodak, we are film. You know, and they were. Like, they were the best. And early on when the first digital cameras came out, Kodak's claim was film is so much better in terms of the quality of the product. And it was true. Like, at multiple stages of improvement, it was still better. But it didn't matter. It was easier, more convenient, and we could share it. And all of the stuff that you didn't have to buy from, you didn't have to take it to be developed, you didn't have to wait for it to be developed, you had to send it copies, you know, it was just all of that. And they caught on like at the end and started rushing out digital products. It was just a little too late. And it has sometimes, it just felt like a really active also. anxiety-provoking metaphor for the church. So, that's, in a sense, digital pluralism, a digitally mediated world of limitless choices where the church is just one more option. And so then, what our job was at the seminary, my job with some grants I was able to lead through the Lilly Endowment, was to think about how to work on that. And so the invitation was into some reconsiderations. What can we think differently about? What can we together encourage each other to think differently about? And the first one I would always say was our situation. We think of these changes and losses as a problem to be solved. And the challenge with that kind of thinking is when you try to solve a problem, you're assuming you know the rules of the game. And the problem is what went wrong in the game we all know how to play. And so you solve it using all of the assumptions and techniques and convictions and what if the rules have completely changed? In that case, then maybe the chance is or what we can reconsider is the current situation is not a problem to be solved. The emerging generation isn't a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be understood and embraced. And the amazing thing about, for me at least, the kind of metaphorical shift from problem to mystery is mystery suddenly offered that, imbued that with so much more value, and called from me so much more curiosity about trying to understand and empathize and connect with, and the willingness to step into a world and sort of think, oh my goodness, maybe I don't know what to do. Which then the second one kind of flowing from that was it gave us a chance to reframe how we imagine intelligence. Intelligence we sort of assume is largely how much do you know? And instead, can it be a willingness to admit how much there is to learn, how much you don't know? And so the new power of questions and the willingness to say three overlooked words, I don't know, which is super hard for leaders to say. Because we have had multiple credentialing ceremonies where we've been given degrees or conferred authority based on our ability to demonstrate what we know. The guys who did Freakonomics, Steve and Stephen.
Levitt.
And anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm a big fan of it, I just can't think of their names. One of their podcasts I listened to early on in which I still think is a super fun podcast, the Stephen Dubner, thank you, Dubner Productions. Stephen Dubner was on leadership and the propensity of people in leadership positions, or the inability of people in leadership positions to admit in public when they did not know the answer to a question. And the amount of wasted time and money because of chasing down bad answers and following up on false presuppositions, and the lack of learning was just incredible. And so when I mention this, it sounds like, oh yeah, no kidding. It's very hard to say I don't know. I think the best way for me to overcome that is to follow it up with 4 more words. What do you think? Because then suddenly you're tapping into a community of knowledge. And it's amazing. Other people know that you don't know, even though we're trained to regularly not admit that, because somehow we see it as a weakness. And so that invitation to collaboration is really powerful. Third, I think we can reframe what we imagine to be the essence of failure and creativity, or the relationship between failure and creativity, that it's so crucial to be willing to fail, to take some chances. I think, there's a lot of quotes from Albert Einstein. I just think that kind of the willingness to keep pushing and trying again and again is crucial. And that in some ways I think, sorry, I'll switch back to that for a second. In some ways I think the task of the leader is to give permission to try, and that means also to fail. Joe and I were talking just probably, I don't know if it was this morning or last night, about how much we've learned over the 2 years of the pandemic about conducting church while not in person. And when we look back at some of our early ventures, they're kind of painful because we failed all over the place. But the gesture itself mattered, and just as much we learned through those. And so one of the striking lines, and I think the more innovative workplaces today, is fail faster. Like, it is not about being afraid to fail. It is, you will fail a certain number of times before you succeed, so do it faster and with more energy and creativity. The last kind of reconsideration I always invited leadership was moving more from a performer, to a coach. And what do you value a coach for? Few of us will remember Phil Jackson's career as a basketball player, but nobody will forget his ability to get out of a group of people more than they thought they had in them. I know, I always have to show the links because, I mean, come on, this is like the only winning team in Minnesota. Has been for a very, very, very long time. We can put the loons there now. Kind of. They're trying. I remember when I was around 10 going on a white river rafting in the Colorado River, and just thinking about, we had a role to play. It took all of us. The river guide's chief job was to help us learn to raft the river. And at the end of the day, it wasn't like you are such a great rafter. It was you helped us have such a great experience and do something we couldn't do. Or I love Julia Child, who, and it's, I think until some of the recent books and movies and documentaries with Julia Child, I had no idea of what a difficult environment she came to be in terms of American and France, in terms of being a woman in a completely male-dominated environment. And then her kind of brilliant insight was, if I can do it, I can teach other people to do it, which was kind of unheard of at the time in cooking. And what we loved about Julia Child was she would, odds are pretty good she'd drop that fish, and then she'd be like, whoa, I'm gonna throw a fish. Yeah, that's not Julia Child.
Love it.
Totally free of charge. And the genius of that was you would see, because I think this actually was a picture from David Letterman's show, that she actually dropped a fish and then picked it up and continued on. And you'd watch it and be like, oh, Julia Child can drop a fish. I can't be that bad, I can keep trying. Or one of my favorite is, again, the orchestra conductor. That at the end of the day, it is the orchestra conductor is the only person on stage who's quiet. Like when you sit back and think about it. The conductor is the one person not making a noise that we expect to hear. And they play a role to be quiet in an institution that is meant to make noise so that everyone else sounds better. And I just love that as kind of a metaphor. So these are all kind of different metaphors to kind of play with. And so then out of that, what I have been trying to urge congregational leaders is to embrace some of those reconsiderations and not stop there, but then to say there's good news and there's bad news about this. And the bad news is that there's no playbook. Like, we don't necessarily know how to be church in this very different world than we used to. But the good news is, wait for it, there's no playbook. Like, you don't have to do it the exact same way it's been done forever. And I know all of that kind of change is way harder than it sounds. But there's something freeing about the ability to recognize you have some freedom. And that's part of what a lot of us, amid the carrying of the weight of the last 2 years and how challenging everything was, there was also this kind of freedom. And for the last year, I've been saying and getting into our staff and our volunteers and our congregational leaders, like, look, this year, do whatever you want. Because we can just, this is one more pandemic influenced year of being Matt Olive. If it doesn't work, we can blame it on the pandemic, or we can be like, go back to the last, we can go back again. No one's expecting this to be forever. But we're going to discover tons of things this year that we never would have had the courage to discover because we would have been too afraid to try for failing. And so the sort of lack of a playbook is really freeing, and that invites instead a chance to experiment and to play and to let go. All right, so that's the stuff I've just been working on. It feels like forever, and then came COVID. With on March 1, think this is going to amount to anything? March 13, holy crap, we can't have church anymore. And March 14, recording the first worship service that we'd ever done and anticipating the next day. And we just 2 months earlier, we celebrated that 1 century earlier, 19 men and women, 14 children had gathered under the name of Mount Olive for the first time. And this is our centennial. It's going to be awesome. We had so much planned, and all of a sudden I was presiding over the first time in 100-year history where people wouldn't be coming to church in Mount Olive. Just a couple days later, and it just kind of threw everything off. But it wasn't just COVID, which is really important to remember too. And the murder of George Floyd, and the justice reckoning, the deferred reckoning of justice and accountability, and a highly polarized political environment. We had a political election during this, the most contentious, and I would wager that over how many years it has been that we've been having elections and peaceful transfers of power, the one that was the closest to being overrun, to having democracy fail, break down, and in a kind of environment where increasingly more and more people, good people, smart people, were lodging more and more of their identity on where they stood on political issues than I'd ever seen or heard or imagined before. And then COVID again, because all of that, it's been 2 years now that we've been contending with all of that. And it has, again, I always feel like I've taken this realistically and being serious and sober, making calculated judgments. I thought the vaccine was going to answer our problems, and it has helped a lot, and not as much as we thought, and so 2 variants later. So here's where I'm at, here's where I want to kind of pause for tonight. I'll offer one hunch, and then a couple of questions. And the questions really, one of them I'd like to kind of spark some conversation tonight and use the 10 minutes or so that we have left on the schedule. And the others I'll try to pick at or get at in the next couple of days, and we can continue to talk about it then. But my main hunch, like that 1970 to 99, 30 years, I think one of the reasons it's been hard to innovate in the church is that what we've been doing has been working for just enough people that the idea of changing was really threatening. And we didn't want to drive away the people for whom it was still working, and they were still showing up, and they were still giving, and they were still occupying leadership roles. Because for that 30 years, again, lucky year for Lutheran, but in general, there was a 2.5% loss per year, which doesn't feel that bad year to year. It's a little discouraging, but it's not that bad. When you look at it 30 years, then, oh my word, it's for some of these traditions 40% or 25%. It's kind of devastating over the long haul. But year to year, you just adjust a little by little by little. So my hunch kind of is that what COVID has really done is it has been very disruptive. But when we look back, I think it will be less seen as a disruptor, something creating entirely novel circumstances, and much more as an accelerator. But I feel like we've experienced that also as a typo, but I wonder if it's a Freudian typo. Decades. My hunch is about a decade, but maybe I'm not sure. Maybe it's 2 decades. And I don't want to just say decline, because I think I've been struck with a number of congregations who, at this point of the game, are simultaneously anxious about the future, particularly will people come back? And so in a very real sense, very fragile, but also have experienced real strength in terms of engagement, in terms of the numbers of people participating in online worship, in terms of giving, in terms of the crisis forcing some hard decisions that probably should have made it earlier, and we're in a better spot now. So I don't want to talk about it just as decline, but I do feel like at least a decade or so's worth of challenges and changes in about 2 years. So that's kind of my hunch, and just helps me frame it differently. And in part to take some confidence, we've been experiencing these disruptions for a while now. This has just forced our hand. This is just so much so quickly. We can't keep adjusting. Well, it's only 2%. Budget's only down $5,000. It is now right in front of us, and we have to respond and have been. So along with that hunch is kind of then a few questions. This one is theoretical. I think it's important and it's something to talk about. I don't know that I have an answer, but in light of the last 2 years, there's an accelerated form in the last 30 in those 6 cultural shifts. What is the role of authority and experience anymore? I remember reading it was Wall Street Journal or Times article. It was around vaccines and interviews with a number of evangelical church pastors. And this subset of pastors were all in favor of vaccines. And to a one, they said, and we cannot say that in our churches. And the conclusion of this writer was, there was a time, a very long time in American life, where faith convictions influenced political convictions. That time is gone. In fact, it is the absolute reverse. Right now, political convictions are far more influential than faith convictions. And I'm guessing every single one of us who is in congregation leadership has had that conversation and you're just sort of like, holy crap. I can't believe what I hear you say. I can't believe you believe this. And I can't believe that you think I, as your pastor and faith leader who have visited you in the hospital and care for your family, am out to destroy this element of your life. This is the conversation I'm thinking of, was around vaccines. It could have been around social justice or race or all kinds of other denominators in the last 2 years. But what do you do when you have angry parishioners sending you, their spiritual leader, blog posts proving that vaccines are a hoax? Or like what, like I do not know what to do or where to go with this in this particular time and place in our world, where because of the omnipresence of produced information, the way that has created an ease for anyone who wants, for any position you hold, to find validation of that and to put your arms around and say, see, what's to distinguish your evidence from them? And the implications of that for anyone in leadership. That's the school board member or the superintendent or the pastor or you name it, elected official, government. So that's one, and I will try to like poke at that a little bit unsatisfactorily. I have a wrong, there we go. Yeah, because behind that is what is truth and how do we assess truth. So here's one that I'm kind of interested in also, because a lot of the news that have come out over the last couple of years is the destructive power of isolation for our elders, and the heartrending stories of families in our congregation who could not see. And it wasn't always just grandma or grandpa; it was a parent or a spouse because of the COVID restrictions, which were important and life-saving, perhaps. And yet the devastating cost of isolation, or the debate that's going on in our schools right now, which is a super fair question in terms of exposure of masks and as we go through the various variants. Like what cost, how do you balance the costs of as being as safe as possible in terms of not spreading the disease and being mentally healthy as possible by dealing with the profound levels of isolation and social deprivation and depression and anxiety spikes that we've seen all over the place. And out of that has come this kind of renewed clamoring for desire for community. And we are one of those places that draws people together meaningfully into authentic relationships of care and community. And how do we not play that in a manipulative sense, but how do we seize on that phenomenal asset? What does it look like, and how do we shape a community today, moving forward? Is our fate or future either kind of a larger, more sociologically, ideologically diverse community that's afraid to talk about anything because of the fissures it could create, or much smaller, much more homogeneous ideological communities that are all agree on all the issues, and so it's very easy to talk about it, that we know we're right, damn it. Like there's gotta be something better. So what does this look like coming out of COVID? I think I would love to explore with you. And then I'm a huge, huge believer in asset mapping and naming strengths. I think when the danger, whether it's a presentation or consulting or assessment, when you primarily tag weaknesses or challenges, it's not long before you feel emotionally overwhelmed. And yet, when you go the other route and start naming assets and strengths in the community and the body, the list becomes equally overwhelming in a positive, energy-creating way. And it's not that you won't have problems, you will, they're there. You will just be armed with a greater sense of all that you bring to bear. And so I'm kind of curious about what are some of the assets that we look at now differently than we might have 2 years ago, and what have we learned positively that we're going to bring forward. Even if the day comes where everyone who's been worshiping online comes back to church, I don't think that day's coming. Even if it did, what would we still have learned from those 2 years of connecting with people in different ways that we would want to bring forward? And then finally, what are the resources in our tradition that can help us? Because I'm a big believer that the best way to honor a tradition is to give it a future, which is not the same as recapitulating it or simply repeating it. But if you feel a debt of gratitude to a tradition or institution, then the debt is to pay it forward that it has continued life, even if it looks different. And so I'd be interested in us kind of talking about that as well. All right, I think that's kind of what I got for tonight. We have a few minutes. I would be zeroing in on the third one maybe just for a little bit. I'm curious, when you think of the last 2 years, what were some of the either kind of really powerful discoveries, the things you know that you probably wouldn't have gotten there in a few years or a decade or who knows when, but are still glad you did and want to carry forward? And what were some of the real surprises that it's just if someone had predicted this, you would have gone, you must have been Colorado, just kidding with the yeah, just open it up.
So I know a number of us, we were talking about outdoor worship in the summer a bit earlier today, and our congregation has a vacant lot right next to us that we acquired. The grass literally was coming up as we were walking down. It was like beautiful God's timing. And so we had this outdoor worship that we're going to continue. Summer worship will be outside from now on. But the surprising thing about that was the number of people who ended up joining our congregation, mostly young adult, mostly queer, that would never in a million years have stepped across the threshold of the door of our church building, because its gorgeous traditional presence is just terrifying. And the one couple that joined our congregation, they just had been able to start coming in, like they would come and sit in the fellowship hall and not come in the sanctuary when we moved back indoors because it was so cold outside. So there's something about this space to me, right? That when you talk about the best way to honor tradition is to give it a future. The tension of that like gorgeous traditional sanctuary and how meaningful and powerful and grounding that is.
Yeah.
And also how terrifying it is to people who have, especially with traumatic experiences with church, right? Is it something that I'm really thoughtful about?
And the revelation it sounds like, it would be for people who never dreamt that would have been like it's our selling point.
Exactly, that's right, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I had not thought of that either. Amazing, thanks. Yeah.
I was really struggling in the fall, and I'd been trying to plant a church, and at the same time pastor an older church, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And I finally had to just put it aside. COVID, and folks just weren't catching on. But then I'm like, at the lowest of the low, I'm like, I've always wanted to look into hospital ministry. And so I did a residency, and all of a sudden, I got to be alongside the bed of like this diverse spirituality of people, Latter-day Saints, non-church, angry. I mean, just, but what really was the secret sauce was compassion. And that was kind of like the uniting thing, like that's what I think we need in our churches too, is compassion. And that's why I guess what I'm going to bring forward. And it's just this beautiful spirituality of all these different people that I can learn from and sit beside, and we can all do that too.
How has that shifted what you think your job is? Because it sounds like it really has.
It's a strange place to be. And I'm still discerning. Yeah. And so, working on that, this retreat.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
I think, at least right now, what I'm noticing is that people are having richer conversations about their daily lives. I mean, and part of that, I think, is like the increasing divergence of how the pandemic has impacted people, right? At first, everybody was like, we're all in this together, and now it's they're very different, but it's leading to some really interesting conversations between, teachers and parents with young children who, we're getting some of our elders to really listen to them about what has it been like for you. And people in healthcare, are getting a much better hearing, I think, than they did before about what is it really like to work in an ER in this environment. And I'm just hearing really rich conversations about faith and daily life that were sort of skimmed over, I think, before, because everything was sort of programmatic, and now people are just so hungry for that fellowship that they're having more of those conversations. And we're hearing from like parents of dads who stopped sleeping that are like, wow, I never knew my husband before 7 p.m. at night, and we had dinner every night together for 2 years. That never happened before, and they're really reconsidering their whole daily life. So at least for some people, it's really, I think, led to some really interesting reconsideration of like, not just what do we do on Sunday morning, but what does daily life look like and
There was this interesting Washington Post article, probably a decade or so ago. One of the small pieces that I remember was kind of broader sense of what is art. How do you define that? How do you recognize that? And one of the little illustrations was in a restaurant near the Metropolitan Art Museum. This restaurant, like many restaurants, had local artists, their watercolors or paintings on the wall, and often you could buy them if you wanted, And so they tracked people's eye movement from when they were sitting at a table sharing a meal, how often they look at the art, And then for a period of time, took down all of the local artists' work and took out priceless pieces of artwork from the Met and put that in the restaurant, and did the same kind of tracking of eye movement, and there was no difference. And it was a larger kind of argument saying it's because people don't expect art, they don't expect real art anywhere other than museums. And in some ways, I have wondered if what we have unintentionally taught our people is that real faith, life, or real experiences of God happen in our beautiful sanctuaries for the people who are going to them. And for nearly 2 years, we couldn't, a year and a half, wherever you were, could not be in those spaces. And did that equally unintentionally prompt a reconsideration of what's worth our attention as Christians, including daily life. And yeah. Thanks. Yeah, please.
I've been wrestling with this, what are our assets? Because I'm feeling very much like our building is the opposite of an asset, it's just killing us. And then what we want to take forward, just a restructuring and rethinking. This problem, I guess, that we have is more what's coming out as the truth. What's coming forth is the truth that we're not so invested in a community or a faith or something, but the building. And if we don't have the building to come to, then is it still the same, and is it still church, and is it still my faith, and is it still my family, and so, I mean, removing the building has just really stirred things up going radically. And I think what's actually emerging is a truth, and that's an asset. But it's also really scary, right? And I'm not sure that's what I want to take forward, except I think it's what we have to take forward.
Yeah.
And so what's gonna be left? I don't know.
Yeah. Gloria Steinem, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off.
Yeah.
Or scary, I mean, yeah, similar. Can you say a little more about the church as the, what's part of the building, is it debt, is it the investment in, like, that's what church is it the obstruction it creates for people who have not had good experiences at church, or all of the above?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of identity wrapped up in the church, and it's cultural identity. But that cultural identity is married to their theological or spiritual identity. And so removing the cultural identity of the church building or the way that the pews are set up or whatever it is, right, really seemed to disrupt a more kind of fundamental sense of the way you believe in God anymore. Are you kidding? Like, we're still the same people, we're still showing up, but it's a different way. We're still, hearing the same words. There's so much that is the same because of tradition.
Yeah.
However, just that huge stumbling block that seems to be this building. And it's interesting with my congregation in particular, their knee-jerk reaction to this was throw more money at the building. Preserve it better, fix it up better, get ready for when we're gonna have our fire and volleyball team, which they haven't had for 30 years. Right? So, do we have money left over to hire a youth and family minister? Who's gonna coach the volleyball team? Who's gonna direct the fire? Like, it's really, this building is really something else.
As year, 18 months, whatever, and now 2 years of not being in church in the same way at least, has it loosened up some of the folks? Or like, do you see some of the other side of the hill?
I mean, some of them got so loose, they're gone. I mean, I think the answer is, of course, yes. I don't know what we're gonna have left.
Yeah.
But I think it's gonna be great.
Yeah.
But I think what's gonna be left is what the remnant is, or whatever that truth that is revealed, right? And I'm hoping that somehow there'll be a leader in that congregation, maybe the pastor, who will help people see that that their faith is so much more than what they knew it was.
Yeah.
Thinking about that coach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would comment, in our situation, I would comment just the opposite. Our building is only 12 years old, so there's no worship of the building. But I'm seeing that word community. It wasn't just being away from the community. It was, the building is where community could happen. And when people are returning to the building, what they're doing is returning to the community. So it's a celebration of coming back, not to the room, but the people in the room.
Yeah. Thank you. Fun to think about this together. And I'm looking forward to kind of the different places where we go. I saw my colleague rise. Very helpful cue.
Thank you, David. I'll invite Anthony up at this point, because we'll have, yes, and thank you.
Here's the new deal. I will keep coming back. back and sort of sharing some stuff to think about, if you don't feel the need to do these.
Can you share your slides as well? Can you send those out?
I can convert it to a PDF and send it that way. The presentation is, unless I can get it to a Dropbox or something, but the PDF I can do easy.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So Mike, Anthony wanted to come up, and the two of you can stay up here, and any questions from the day or comments? We kind of naturally transitioned into discussion there, so we can kind of keep that going in some sense. We'll do maybe 10 minutes or.
They can sit down, right?
Yeah, if you guys want to bring a chair or indeed. Okay, we'll go maybe 10 minutes or so. We can keep talking about the same issues, or if you have, I mean, and Anthony, I'd love to hear your commentary on this too, either around college kids. I think too. And, but if any questions from this morning's lecture from Dr. Batista and, the lecture this morning and such too. So maybe like 9 minutes or so, and then I'll rise again, and we'll take a break. Yeah, at that time before worship. Okay. So any discussion?
Can I comment?
Please, yeah, please. Yeah.
I really appreciate what you were offering, what you were saying. And it really helps me because I'm not someone who ever does like any sociological surveying kind of data, stuff like that. I just sort of was going out there. 16th century, I have plenty of answers, but I just have instincts and that kind of thing. So this is coming from that kind of space, my comment. There's a lot of tensions in the patterns you pointed to that just sort of puzzle me in some ways. So like you point to a shift from duty to discretion, thank you. But on the other hand, there's this sort of narrative about kids today that are a part of the cancel culture, the policing every aspect of people's behavior. So there seems to be like a very strong sense of duty in some areas. You need to take a stand on Black Lives Matter, on trans rights, on Israel-Palestine, but not so much you have a duty or a stand on going to church or supporting local social institutions and institutions. So is that a fair sense of things? Like, is it duty versus discretion, or is it just shifting landscape of duties and obligations?
That is so helpful. These are hunches. My hunch is this emerging generation has been inundated by choices in a way that no previous generation has. And that's where the word discretion comes from. They have to exercise discretion. And so maybe it's pairing that with recognizing that the part about constructing identity, that's the end result of that. There's so much more active, and so maybe the duty or the inescapable, whether they think of it as a duty or not, inescapable is in fact to fashion an identity around issues and choices, and then depending on the group that they're aligned with, it takes on its own kind of obligation. The obligation to the, I will say this as a paying parent, typically.
Thank you, Director.
The typical stable student, if everyone's doing their job right, their sense of duty and obligation to the larger polis, the issues of the day will be very, very different than the children of the anti-vaccine family who has said all of these sources of information are not safe. They're not legitimate. This is the source of information. So whether it's a sense of duty or obligation or an inescapable part of constructing identity, and then you can never not have obligations to the community set that you identify with. So anyway, but it helps me think about it more, so I appreciate that. And I will say, I had so many things I wanted to say about forgiveness.
You go tomorrow morning, so just get in there.
But that's not my job. Oh my God.
Well, then, for everybody, get out here.
So Anthony, I wanted to ask the question with your working definition of forgiveness.
Yes.
You were talking about with the hope of a better relationship to come.
Yes.
And maybe you're going to get to this, but is it necessary for, if I'm asking for forgiveness, is it necessary for a person to give it to me, for me to receive it?
It's a great question. That's also on Wednesday. I'll give you a 14.
I can wait. I can wait too.
Yeah. So my thinking on this is I'll say two things quickly, and maybe I'll expand on them on Wednesday. My short answer is yes. I will say that yes, there can be a duty to forgive someone. Why that would exist? Well, insofar as you want a relationship with someone, as you're committed to them, then you are obligated to follow the means to make that happen. So otherwise, you're having two different things you want, and you're not sort of connecting the two of them. And so a better way of thinking about this is, for me, is Christologically in terms of salvation. Does God have to forgive us? No. But insofar as Christ tells us that God wants a certain relationship with us, then forgiveness sort of has to flow from that. My second point is that insofar as we get, I think, anxious saying there's a duty to forgive, we think of that as a right being claimed by somebody who has been an offender. You say, you have to forgive me. And something else could be happening there. Rhetorically, or in that sort of demand that I be forgiven, usually something else is happening there, more often than not. And even if something sort of problematic isn't happening there, let's say the person really does deserve forgiveness, they're asking for it and not getting it. I think more often than not, when it's not being given, it's because the person doesn't have it to give. So yes, I can see that if I had more courage or more strength, or I would give you forgiveness in a better world, with a better person. But now we're seeing perhaps the limits of my abilities. And so the reason I want to say that there's still a duty there to forgive, an obligation to forgive, is it highlights the sort of tragic picture that I just tried to paint. Yes.
Hard is when you phrase it that way, it feels suddenly like there's a coercive element.
Yeah.
And that's what feels bad.
Yes.
Even though it would perhaps be better if it could happen, you know?
I guess I think it's more about how we use the language of duty or need than it is sort of built into the ideas of duty. And
Yeah.
at least in my thinking. Like, we tend to use it in very coercive ways. I'm a parent, so I have both been attempted coercion on my children, and they have also attempted it on me. Someone's both been successful in both directions. And it spills out in all my relationships. So yes, there are all kinds of ways that I think we can misuse things that could be good things in other situations when we use them for people or for harm or for wrong. Our ability to do that is infinite, in my sense. And this is where the language of virtue is a language that I really enjoy, because it sort of defines, by definition, a virtue is something you're using that is good for good.
Yeah.
And if you start using something that for bad, it might be a virtue, it actually becomes a vice. Which is why I was sort of gesturing towards like courage. These things where like, yes, we have an idea of courage. It's, risking your life for the sake of others or a good cause. We think that's a good thing. Jesus says, lay down your life for your friends. Courage is good. But if you're laying it down for an unjust cause, like anti-vaccination stuff, or you're causing harm to healthcare providers, or you're going to overturn an election, or you're rushing into a battle you don't need to be into, or you're not feeling enough fear at COVID-19's damage to your body and your community. All these things are calling courage right now for actions, foolhardiness. So, something else.
I guess the reason I was asking the question is I had a pretty life-changing event where I had a really negative thing happen to me. And many years later, I went back to the person and asked for, it was my fault, I asked for forgiveness. They weren't able to give it to me. And I certainly understand why. But thinking about the language that Jesus uses of binding and loosing, I kind of, over time, was able to realize that I actually, without that person being able to forgive me, I was able to receive forgiveness because I was not bound by that anymore. I did my best to make amends and try. And so then I wonder, and again, I think you're going to get to this, but the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. There was no ability for reconciliation, but I got forgiveness because I'm no longer bound by that.
So that's why I would say that in my way of thinking about it, that's sort of a partial or adjacent to forgiveness kind of experience. I still wouldn't want to call that forgiveness. And to make it maybe somewhat clear. Think about love. I said, I really love this person. love them so much. I've done all the things that a loving person would do. And that person says, I don't love you. But I've given us love. I've made love happen. I feel love in my heart. That's okay, I suppose. But you can't say that I love you when we're in a relationship of love. You can't have that without me. And that's how I feel about forgiveness in the same way. So, what you're describing to me sounds like a very healthy and proper way to move forward. And I think that you have a sense of yourself, I'll get to more of this as well. You have a sense that you aren't the same person who did that thing that you needed to ask for forgiveness for a long time ago. And that you have enough sense of yourself to know that that's in the past, but it's still yours. You start wrestling with that, what to do with that. You're not letting the past bind you. And you're trying to appreciate and love the person you are now. I kind of checking all that off, that all sounds wonderful. But I still want to hold on to this sense that forgiveness still hasn't quite happened. Particularly since that person still doesn't see you as the new person, or isn't able, in whatever ways, to hope for some kind of relationship going forward. Beyond sort of, you're just too far away, or that kind of thing, but just, in the bare minimum sense of what a relationship might be. Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
No, I'll stop, I'll save it.
David, I had a question that I'm kind of asking all of you. So it was my experience in the last couple of years that people seem to have less of a need to hear God's story and more of a need to tell their story. That where I even would do Bible studies where we could check in, how do you find yourself tonight? How do you bring yourself highs and lows, or as trivial as that would be? Whereas at one point, maybe in an hour, the highs and lows of sharing would be 15 minutes, and the Bible study 45. But it seemed like people needed almost 50-50. And so there was a shift. And I wonder what that means for the church, focusing on telling God's story, the faith story. How do we invite people then? Freedom, and maybe that's about community, about feeling isolated. Am I making myself at all clear?
Yeah.
And I want to give you all notice that shift, if that's something that you notice.
Yeah, for sure, although I don't think I named it until you just asked that question. That slide where it's like a little Bible, and then all these other things kind of cluster around it. I think part of the invitation in this mystery, this more mysterious time, put it this way, I think often I was taught, maybe sometimes I taught, that the most important thing about Bible study was good exegesis, like to understand what that story is. And I think one of the things in recent years, and maybe that's sharpened by our recent experience, my feeling is that the most important thing about Bible study is not figuring out the original intent of the author, to name it that way, but to find ourselves in that story, to see ourselves in that story. And I'm wondering if we can do that very well, particularly when there's a heightened level of trauma or stress.
But even
without
before
spending more time on telling our story.
Even before people want to see themselves in that story, whatever that story is, they have a great need to just talk about their story.
Yeah.
Right now, apart from that, and I saw a greater shift in it.
Yeah. Do you think that will persist, or do you think it was part of the coping with a really stressful? Like we had talking about things is one of the most important ways to master a situation, or to gain sense of competence in a situation, better language, is to talk about it, to name what's been hard. So I'm curious if this persists, or if there's equilibrium, or we connect those, my story and biblical story.
Well, it's just that hunger for community again, before we gather for knowledge or something. We want community to get that story.
I think this will
social media being a pretty present factor, especially for people of all ages, but especially for folks who are still learning their self-identification. The primary thing that social media allows you to do is perform your life to other people, and that commentary about how we're no longer so much audience as participants. I think we are also, all of us, performers for each other all the time, and social media becoming one of the primary ways that we interact with each other just highlights the performative nature of that. And so I think when people are gathering and want to be seen, church is one of those places, ideally speaking, where you can genuinely be seen beyond the performance, where the vulnerability is able to crack through, where you're able to be boring, where you're able and have people care about that. I also think that for just speaking from a generational perspective, for folks around me a little bit younger than me, what I hear about what they're looking for from God is they think of religion as being agreeing to a set of facts or truths that once you've done that, it's the resolution. And I think that there's a degree to the way that we approach salvation that encourages that. If you believe, you're saved. But I think that what we can do is, and what we need to emphasize, is that God wants to know us. Badly wants to know us. And the cross is pretty clear. God goes through anything to know us on our own terms. And I think that telling our stories in the church, in the body of Christ, and having that story held in all of its, I've been in these situations where sometimes you're like, I'm trying to care about what you have to say about it. It's a pretty boring day, but I'm struggling to. But I think that that's the practice of the church, of being that interest that God has in others for them in that place. And I think that once people know that the church as God's body on earth cares about their story, even if it's not pretty, even if they don't have the right Instagram filters or whatever it is, or they don't have the haptic feedback of getting a buzz every time that someone gives them a like. If they know that this is a place that is concerned with their story in its complexity and mundanity, they might start to think that that's a God worth worshiping and being in a relationship with, not just a God that's worth ascending to or being aware of but holding at a distance, but a God worth wanting and equal to share.
Very, very helpful. Matt, why don't we, you had it up earlier, why don't we do that, and then Chandler, we take a break? Perfect.
Well, it seems to me the only people that were interested in the theological issues with Jesus were the Pharisees and the religious professionals, and the people that came to him. It was like Tommy and Lou, see me, feel me, touch me, hear my story. And isn't that what we need to do? And it's hard because we don't have the resources to do that. We don't have the choir director, the youth director. That's the struggle, you know. But the churches, I think, well, the other thing I was going to mention is how do we? Well, I just finished reading Peril. Just stumbled upon it. It's Woodward of Watergate fame, and some guy wrote it. But it has the interesting. I'd recommend it to you because he had the wisdom or the insight to be interviewing Trump before any of this stuff happened. So he's got this body of interviews that kind of flow through the whole thing that David just brought up before us, this whole COVID thing. And so we get this interesting look at this leader that in some ways has been, you know, making our life crazy. But one of the things that's so revealing about that book, I'm not going to get political here at all, but it shows the South Carolina Senator, I just lost, Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham trying to convince this president to say, I was wrong here. And no matter what you think of Graham, I mean, he's really been trying, and he's been doing it because he needs this president to do that for this Republican Party to just kind of be a party again. But my point in that is saying is if you've got, I don't know, pick a number, 45, 50% of the people, including a big number of our young people, whose hero is refusing to admit defeat, refusing to forgive, refusing to do anything that has anything to do with the stuff that we're teaching, boy, where do we go with that? And I think that's a fundamental issue in our churches. It's a stewardship issue. It's we just I had half of my people driving pickups with don't tread on me, you know, snakes on the back. Good people, but my gosh, they're how do you, hey priest, what are they hearing? You know, all we need is that hero to just say, yeah, I was wrong, you know, I beg your forgiveness. Yeah, not gonna happen.
First two verses of chapter 15, where lost son or prodigal father, whatever you call it, and all of the tax collectors and sinners were eager to hear, and the scribes and Pharisees were grumbling. So he told them to
I think we both, I think Greg